Now I come to the second part of today's session, in which I will briefly sketch the years 1400 through 1800 in international political economy. And the reason I can do this very quickly is because I think that the two authors of our textbook, O'Brien and Williams, do a pretty good job in describing these developments. And also, if we look at the 7 dangers that I just described, I also think they are pretty good in avoiding those 7 dangers and giving a balanced representation of the difference of history that we look at there. And the central element of their description is represented in this map, which is roughly based on the account of Abdullah and which they amended by adding some other regions. And what you see here are 12 regional economies that were, by today's standards, all international. So they all transcend what today would be state borders. And of course, also back then, they all transcended the borders of societies, if you will. All of these regional economies that are represented as circles here, they basically mean that there were stable, established trade routes that were used regularly over a large amount of time. What you see at the very right-hand side of the map are the 2 regional economies they name in the Americas, which is first the Inca Empire, which is number 12 here, and secondly the Central American regional economy, which was first dominated by the Maya Empire and then was becoming to be dominated by the Aztec empires. And both of these had mainly land-bound trade routes that, particularly in the case of the Inca Empire, stretched over very long distances, being a couple of thousand kilometers. What you see in the center on the right-hand side of this map are the regional economies they name for Eurasia and for Africa. And these span from the Philippines in the very east to the Western African coast in the very west, from Northern Europe in the north to Madagascar in the south, and with a strong center in Central America and what today would be the Middle East. What's interesting to see here that there are 2 routes from China to Europe. One is seabound. It begins in the South Chinese Sea, moves through the Gulf of Bengal, the Arabian Sea, the Red Sea, to the Mediterranean Sea. And of course, back then there was no Suez Canal, so you could not really move along this whole route by ship. You at least had to bridge a tiny amount of land, tiny as compared to the whole route that you were taking. The other one is what was called the Silk Route, which led from China to today's Middle East, and then you could also connect via the Mediterranean Sea to Europe. And the reason why this is interesting is because right now China has this big infrastructure project, which they also model on these 2 routes from China to Europe, and one of these routes luckily ends in Duisburg. What's important to note here is that none of these regions dominated the other regions. There was more productions, maybe in region number 8 and number 7, than in other regions, but there was no clear hierarchy here. This, however, changed dramatically. If we jump into the future for a couple of 100 years, which then is today's present, we can create this map. And this map represents the history of European colonialism. What you see here in purple are the European countries. What you see in green are all the countries that the European colonized over the last couple of 100 years. We can discuss some details of this map. For example, it was never the case that all the green countries were colonized at the same time, because at the time that colonization in Africa really took hold territorially, most of the Americas were already decolonized, and you can also discuss some of the other interpretations here, but in general this is the world of the last couple of 100 years, with Europe dominating all the others. And so obviously something dramatic must have happened between the first map and the second map. I'm not going to describe this process in detail here. I'm only giving a few general points. The first, and I repeat this because I want to emphasize this, is that in 1400 there was nothing special about Europe. There was an important regional economy in Europe. There were trade routes in the Baltic Sea, on the continent, in the Mediterranean Sea, and there was trade between Europe and other parts of the world. But Europe was but one world region among others. And if we were to agree that there was such a thing as progress, Europe was by no means the most progressive world region. When we think of science and technology, they were probably behind China. If we think of economic productivity, the most productive regions in the world were probably in Southern Asia and Eastern Asia, not in Europe. If we think of military power, European militaries were by no means able to overpower the militaries of other societies. And if anything, the Europeans were driven around the world by a lack, not by their unique capacities or capabilities. Because, and O'Brien and Williams stressed this once and again, the Europeans didn't have commodities that everyone else desired, but the Europeans desired commodities that they had to get somewhere else, and these were in particularly spices and silk. They wanted spices from Africa and Asia, and they wanted silk from China. So they had very strong commercial interest in international trade with other societies, and what they had to offer in exchange was not any great commodity that everyone desired. They probably mostly had to pay in silver and gold because they didn't produce anything that everyone else wanted. And then certain events did take place and certain innovations did take place in Europe that finally allowed the Europeans to expand across the globe. And part of these developments were in naval technology, though they developed better technologies for sailing, for building ships, for navigating ships, which allowed them to sail ever further and ever faster. And again, here they were technologically probably not way ahead of any other of all other societies, of the Chinese in particular. However, they also had a very strong incentive to expand their maritime capabilities because they wanted this trade, particularly with Asia, and they didn't want to go through to the Middle East as they had to because, as you saw, the Silk Road was moving through the Middle East, and also if you took the maritime road, you also had at some point to cross Middle Eastern lands. So they had an incentive to find a maritime route to China. And one of these routes went around Africa through the Indian Ocean to China, and the other one went supposedly across the Atlantic Ocean and then hopefully to China. And both of these attempts to sail to China finally worked out well for the Europeans when it comes to the goal of dominating the world. Because on the one hand, the expansion around Africa, it made them build ever better ships, ever bigger ships, and also arming these ships with cannons. And so this led to a world in which the Europeans were able to dominate trade in Asia and also to set up permanent trading posts at Asian coastal towns, and so they were able to dominate the trade there. The attempt to sail to China via the Atlantic, of course, led to Europeans arriving in the Americas in greater number, and it particularly led to the Spanish and the Portuguese conquering larger parts of the Americas, so first in Southern America and then Central America. And what they did there economically was extracting gold and silver in particular. And this gold and silver could then be used for trade with Asian countries. And this, of course, is a very reduced account of what they did there, because what they also did there was taking action that resulted in destroying entire societies and millions of people dying there. And this was the beginning of European colonialism, and you can distinguish 3 or 4 forms of European colonialism. One is this kind of colonialism, particularly performed by the Spanish and the Portuguese, which was mostly about extracting gold and silver from the Americas, but also by spreading Christianity there. The second form was also already mentioned, was the maritime colonialism, which aimed at dominating trade in Asia. It was first performed by the Portuguese, then by the Dutch, and then by the English. And then we also had this kind of more territorial colonialism and settler colonialism, which was first aiming at North America and at South Africa, where plantations and other economic forms were implemented. And then finally we had the territorial colonialism that was enacted in the scramble for Africa, and finally also in the conquest of some Asian nations. When we think about today's world economy, we have to think of the fact that it has become the economy that it has become because of its colonial past. This does not mean that there wouldn't be a world economy without colonialism, but the world economy that we have today is the one that was shaped in colonialism. And you can see remnants of this colonial past in many aspects of today's international political economy. I want to add two more points here. The first is, just because the world that we have today was shaped by colonialism, this does not mean that you can blame any ill or wrong in the world on colonialism. You find this type of thinking in some leftist discourses, you find it in some anti-colonial discourses, and oftentimes there's some merit to it, because in most things that happen in the world you find some traces of colonialism. However, you cannot just blame colonialism for anything or blame anything on colonialism, because this mostly gives a very undercomplex account of history, and it also makes other non-colonial histories invisible, and that's something you should not engage in. However, and this is my last point here, there is hardly anything in the world that is not a product of or affected by the colonial past in one way or the other.